Hello and welcome to the second part of the mini lecture on supporting evidence. Now, supporting evidence is anything that we can use to support our points in a speech. Aristotle called this logos, or good reasons for the audience to accept our argument. Now, as we're going to see, evidence comes in many forms. And we'll talk about three or four of them. We'll talk about facts and stats. We'll talk about descriptions, definitions, and explanations. We'll talk about testimony, and we'll talk about examples. First, let's talk about facts and statistics. Now, factual statements are used to support a point. For example, most local business owners support Fantasy Fest. Now, if you notice, this statement is not an absolute. It's meant to be argued for or against. Aristotle takes evidence and puts it in, or logos, and divides it into two parts. He calls it proofs and inartistic proofs. Now, the previous statement would be an example of an inartistic proof. And that is, it's an argument that's not self-evident. It requires the art of rhetoric or persuasion to prove it. Now, statistics are numerical representations of facts. Used in the Fantasy Fest example, Fantasy Fest accounts for 25% of the city of Key West's annual revenue. Statistics are very effective, but they should be used in a fashion that's easy to understand. Stay away from obscure numbers. You want to try to round up and round down. 25%, 3 out of 4, 75%, 1 out of 10. They're meant to help people to understand rather than to obscure. And so statistics are another type of evidence we could use. Definitions, descriptions, and explanations also help us to prove our point. Now, a definition is meant to clarify something, perhaps jargon, or something that the audience doesn't understand. Maybe we're talking about an example of childhood obesity, and we need to define the word obesity. According to the CDC, childhood obesity occurs when children are 35% over their ideal weight. Now, of course, this is just a made-up statistic, but it gives you an idea. Using the Fantasy Fest example, Fantasy Fest is a local festival that occurs in Key West in October, and it combines the best of traditional type of festivals with a little bit of unique flavor from the Keys. And that might be a definition to help clarify Fantasy Fest for some people who don't know what it is. Now, an explanation goes a little bit farther. It attempts to create a picture in the minds of the audience using our words. Maybe we want to talk about Goombay as the start of Fantasy Fest, the celebration. And we might describe it as a celebration of smells and sounds and colors. And we would get into a further description. Maybe even we wanted to talk about what the smells are, what the sounds are, what the colors. We're using sensory language to try to explain or paint a picture for our audience. Now, explanations go even further than definitions or descriptions. They get into talking about the how of something works. Models are great for explaining how and why. Maps are great for explaining the how and the why. Let's talk about examples. We can have actual examples. Maybe it's a tourist recount of the wonderful time they had in Fantasy Fest here in Key West. Or perhaps it's a hypothetical example to prove a point. Maybe you want to invite somebody to come and visit. Imagine it might go something like this. It's an early autumn in Cleveland and the weather is crisp. The leaves have already started to turn and you know that the first snow is just around the corner. As a matter of fact, you're already scanning the TV guide looking for the first Rocky Marathon. But then you see a commercial for Key West and you think to yourself, wow, Key West in October, isn't that great? That's a hypothetical example. An extended example is simply a story. Maybe everybody's got a sort of a crazy uncle. I'm the crazy uncle in my family. Hard to believe, I know. And maybe Uncle Sal is telling the same story at Thanksgiving year after year. But this year, Uncle Sal comes with a new story, the time that he visited Key West in October for Fantasy Fest. And everybody is thrilled with Uncle Sal's new story. Testimonies are another type of evidence. And we can break them down into expert testimony and peer testimony. Using the Fantasy Fest example, we could talk about the mayor and the members of the Chamber of Commerce president and maybe even some of the business owners as experts. Expert testimony, if we're going to get away from Fantasy Fest, you might think about product endorsements or advertising. Maybe you were thinking of buying a new iPhone. Steve Jobs, well, now Steve Jobs from heaven, would have been probably the best expert on the apple. Peer testimony is something different. Your peers are the people that you have a direct relationship with. They're on the same level. Peers are your peers in this class. Maybe you have a classmate, Aaron, for instance. So we'll just use that as an example, who's interested in buying a new iPhone. And Erin has purchased the brand new iPhone 4S, and she said it's the best phone she's ever owned in her life. This phone is indestructible. It's, aside from being great, it just is really indestructible. Her dog has peed on it. She's washed it. She's even run it over in her car, and hopefully not in that order exactly. But it is still the best phone she's ever had to this day. So testimony is just one of the many forms of evidence that we have available to us as a speaker to help us prove our point. So we began this lecture with a recap of audience analysis and posed the question of whether audience analysis and evidence have any relationship. We answered this question with a resounding yes, and noted that what we discover in the process of audience analysis can often be used to support our points. We also said that there are many different types of evidence, so we looked at 3 or 4: facts and statistics, definitions, descriptions, and explanations, as well as examples and testimony. Now, obviously, these are just but a few of the ways that you can use to support your points in a speech. For our next mini lecture, we'll be discussing the importance of effective introductions and conclusions. See you then.